Well, today we're going to talk about a crazy feature of the Chevrolet Astro GMc Safari vans. They're produced from 1985 through the 2005 model year in two different generations. And I'll get to that in 1 second. But first, a little bit about these particular vans. I actually think the first generation that was produced from 1985 through 1994 is actually quite handsome. I mean, despite the fact that you have these extremely upright sides, which at least gave the interior quite a bit of space, the styling's pretty cool, particularly the front end with that blacked out grille and the single headlamps. Not many vehicles with single headlamps on either sides look cool, but this van looks a little bit menacing. I like the proportion as well of the relatively short hood and the tall windshield and the angle at which the windshield sits. It's pretty upright, certainly in stark contrast to the other minivan that General Motors would start producing there in this time frame, the so-called Dustbusters, that had just about the longest windshield ever and consequently the longest interior dashboard ever as well. I don't know how you ever clean the windshield without some special appliance on those. But the Chevrolet Astro and GMc Safari were quite popular in their day. You have to remember that Chrysler had just introduced the minivan in 1984, and General Motors and Ford really didn't have anything that was competitive. And so they decided to go in a significantly different direction than Chrysler, at least at first. Remember, Chrysler really just had the K car to build upon, and hence the minivan had to work as a front-wheel drive unibody vehicle. But the Aerostar and the Astro were significantly different in philosophy. The idea here was that you had a van that was more compact than the full-size vans, but you could still tow your boat, tow whatever you needed to do, and it was much more rugged than the Chrysler minivans were. So it was a good philosophy. Of course, both Ford and General Motors would eventually go to constructing a true minivan that was a unibody car based on a front-wheel drive platform not that many years thereafter. But Chevrolet did sell Chevrolet and GMC sold a combined 3 million Astro vans over the vehicle's entire lifetime from 1985 to 2005. So it really wasn't that bad of a seller. They were all produced in Baltimore. That was the only plant that produced these vehicles, and it was the last vehicles that the Baltimore assembly plant would produce after having opened in 1935. It would close after the 2005 model year Astros and Safaris were produced. One other little interesting tidbit about the Astro and Safari is, as you know, the GMC variant was named the Safari, the Chevrolet variant was named the Astro, but GMC also was producing an Astro during this time frame. And what do I mean? Well, GMC, don't forget, was producing semi-trucks and semi-tractors at this particular point in time. And the cab-over variant that GMC produced was known as the Astro. They, of course, had the GMC General as well, which was a more traditional semi-cab and in the traditional style. But the cab-over Astro was a pretty awesome semi. If I had a CDL, I would love to own one of those with a Detroit diesel V12 under the cab. And the Astro actually had a pretty amazing interior as well. This wraparound dash was quite revolutionary for semi-trucks during the time frame. But in any event, I digress. Back to the Chevrolet, not GMC Astro, and the GMC Safari. Now, one of the challenges of that short hood that you saw in the previous photos was that it shoved the engine and transmission further rearward in the van. And that meant that in order to service the engine, you really had to undo a cover that was inside the passenger compartment, remove the cover, and then you had access to the engine, as you see here. This particular one has a 4.3-liter V6. These vans came with a number of engines, mostly the 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine, which was discontinued partway through the run, and then the 4.3-liter V6 is what many of these have in either carbureted or throttle body variant, or in this case, the central port injection variant with the spider injector. Ooh, but we're not going to talk about the spider injector today because that's a whole nother video. But notice that you have this pretty intrusive hump in the passenger space that's required in order to be able to service the engine and get to the spark plugs and various other elements, certainly the spark plug wires, distributor cap in some cases. But a consequence of this particular hump is that it obviously intrudes on passenger space as well. Now, this was not unique. The full-size vans had a similar setup where in order to service the engine, you could undo a cover and remove it and then service the engine and get better access. But for whatever reason, the way that GM packaged the Chevrolet Astro and GMC Safari was such that this hump was especially intrusive and more intrusive than in competitive vehicles like the Aerostar. And the main area of, I would say, issue was the footwell room. And on the driver's side, it was a tight footwell. You notice that GM used this very short, abbreviated brake pedal that was really used in cars that had manual transmissions where you had a clutch pedal, and that's why the brake pedal was smaller. But they did that in order to provide the driver with more foot room and for more longer-term comfort. Now, the interesting thing is there's obviously no pedals in the passenger footwell, unless, of course, it's like a driver's ed car or something like that. But because if you take a look at this particular photo, you'll notice that the hump for the engine is actually shifted slightly to the passenger side. And as a consequence, the passenger footwell on these vans is just an abysmal place to rest comfortably. There is no foot space whatsoever, or hardly any foot space, for a passenger to sit. You're really sitting in the penalty box if you're in the front seat of an Astro. In fact, I would say if you're trying to be a passenger and you don't have a cargo Astro or Safari, you're better off to sit in one of the rear seating areas as opposed to in that front seat, because there's no place to put your foot comfortably in order to get enough space. Interestingly, I will say that on the driver's side, the footwell is narrow. I mentioned that there's a bit more space. They have that stubby brake pedal. But there's another packaging flaw with these, and that is that the accelerator pedal is really too close to that hump. And if you have a foot that is of decent size, when you accelerate, your foot is basically brushing up on the hump because the accelerator pedal is too close to it. You almost want to bend the accelerator pedal mounting so that that pedal is further away from the hump. There's certainly enough space between it and the brake pedal. But again, curious packaging decisions by GM on this Astro and Safari. I suspect that they shifted the hump a little bit to the passenger side because they knew the pedal box had to go in the driver's side footwell area. But in doing so, they left the passenger with really no space. And I can't think of any other vehicle that has worse passenger seat comfort in the front seat than these Astros and Safaris as a consequence. Now, I did mention that GM would refresh the Astro and Safari partway through the run in the 1995 model year. And interestingly, one of the things that they did not do as part of that refresh would be to enlarge that pedal box or do anything to help out in that regard. The refresh, let's say, bestowed upon the interior far more plasticky materials than the first generation even. They're just a ton of hard plastic. It's very unattractive. I actually think the first generation interior is kind of cool. There was even a digital dash that was offered for a few years. But in the second generation, you would think that after such a long run from 1985 to 1994, and it had to be a principal complaint from customers during this era that there was no passenger footwell space, that GM would have done something to ameliorate this particular issue. But unfortunately, they didn't. Instead, I suppose they decided to invest some of their capital in the so-called Dutch doors out back. The previous generation Astro just had the typical bifolding doors. But one of the things that GM did on the second generation was they offered these Dutch doors with the big kind of lift gate and then these two little doors underneath it. I have no idea if that was a benefit to anybody. I can't understand the benefit of tooling up something like that versus the general bifolding doors. Maybe somebody else has a better idea as to why that was a great idea versus just the simple bifolding doors. Put a comment in the comment section because I really can't figure that one out. So in general, the Chevrolet Astro and GMC Safari have some very curious engineering and packaging decisions. The vans overall were pretty reliable. The 4.3-liter V6 was quite good, especially the throttle body injected variant. The central port injected variant, I would say, was okay. The Spider injector, which was kind of a cheap way of achieving multi-port injection. It was a single large injector that kind of spun around, and it would feed fuel through various tubes into the intake ports of each cylinder. Only GM could come up with a cool invention like that. It's like a multi-port on the cheap. And the Spider injector would just spin around and fire fuel down each of those legs, if you will. But the rest of the vehicle just has, like I said, some curious decisions. And overall, I think they're kind of getting a little bit of momentum from a collector standpoint. I will say the Aerostar probably has more collector momentum. And some of the Aerostar trims, like the Eddie Bauer trim, are pretty cool. I wouldn't mind owning one of those. And I think the Aerostar was probably a better vehicle than the Safari and Astro. Maybe even looked better. Certainly better than the second generation. But in any case, what do you think? Put a comment in the comments section. Did you ever have to ride in the passenger seat of one of these? What was your thought once you sat in? I remember the first time I got into one of these in the passenger side, I remember thinking, what the heck is going on here? Where's the rest of the space? Where do I put my feet? There's barely enough room for 2 feet together in this tiny little footwell. Put a comment, like I said, in the comment section, and thanks again for watching.